What is going on? This is Ryan with Automatic Comics, and I just decided that I needed to make a video about this topic because I feel like we as collectors have very short memories, and we seem to forget all the pain and suffering that we experienced just a couple years ago during the comic boom when we had books spike in price that were not highly graded, didn't have lots of volume of graded books, only to have them crash and people just get burned that were buying into the hype in those books. So, what I am talking about here is Dave Stevens. I mean, the Dave Stevens covers, I mean, they are fun. They're great. Like, I'll call it like the Copper Age good girl art covers. I mean, that's what they are. I mean, they're Copper Age, good girl art, and they've always had somewhat of a following. But over the last about 6 months to a year, it's just been bananas. And so, point out a couple things, and then we'll talk about why I think there's some concerns here and just what you should consider if you are looking to bid on some of these books. And I'll give you my little bit of advice up front. I wouldn't be bidding on these books. I mean, I think the downside risk is extremely high. And so we'll talk about a couple of things. One, this is Comic Link. Comic Link has a number of Dave Stevens books. You can see I just did a search for Dave Stevens in the description. Got 33 items. These are in this auction, the next upcoming auction, and a few that ended recently. And you can see, like, people talk about Dave Stevens and they're like, oh, it's so rare in a 9.8. It's like 9.8, 9.8. 9.8, 9.8, 9.8, 9.8. I mean, just they are not rare in a 9.8. Okay, there may be a couple exceptions, but they are not rare in a 9.8. And it's just there are a lot of them out there, and there are a lot more of them out there now because the value has jumped, and now we've got a lot more people sending them in when it wasn't worth it before. The same thing has happened with other books. And I'm going to go into those, and then we'll talk about these books too. I also saw this one. I think this is what made me decide to make this, is that, I mean, we're even having a dedicated Dave Stevens auction on Shortbox now. You know, I mean, I get it. Like, people know how to sell the hype, but you got to be careful. Like, if you can afford to lose the money, I mean, who cares? Go ahead, bid, buy the books that you want. But if you are at all concerned about losing that money, you know, about these books correcting severely over probably a relatively short period of time, then I would recommend listening to what I have to say in this video. So what we're actually going to start with is we're going to start with West Coast Avengers number 45. If you are not familiar with this book or you don't remember this book, this is this book right here. First appearance of the White Vision. Now, I think we all remember from WandaVision that when this character made an appearance, this book just went insane. And prices went crazy. I mean, let's take a look at the prices for a 9.8. I mean, look at this. Prior to WandaVision, I mean, this is WandaVision right here. Prior to WandaVision, this was $200 book, $150 book in a 9.8. It hit a peak sale of $2,000 or $1,950. It is now all the way back down. You can see here at around a $150, $200 book. It has completely returned to what it was prior to that boom. And this isn't necessarily just because of the hype that's gone away, the comic boom, that kind of thing. This is where understanding the census is actually important. Now, I'm a person that says generally for vintage books, the census isn't all that important because, I mean, it gives you an idea of what's out there, but raw books and graded books for long-term keys, well-known keys that have an established fan base, tend to sell for pretty similar prices. The price difference between raws and graded have really come together for a lot of big books. The exceptions are 9.8s, like really high grades, like 9.6s and 9.8s, and then books that were not popular before. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to this website called cgcdata.com. This website is pretty cool. If you've never checked it out, it has a lot of useful information on it. And basically, they track all this. They have all the census data for CGC for multiple years. And you can search and see what the census was at different points in time. So I've got West Coast Avengers number 45 here. And this, I did the search on December 29th, 2020, before White Vision. You can see 120 copies on the census, 41 9/8, 23 9/6, 22 9/4. I mean, people weren't grading this book all that much because it just didn't have much value. Now let's look at the current census for this book. 2,389 copies. This got graded 20x. 20x copies got graded. 9/8 went from 41 to 292, 7 times as many. 9/6 went from 23 to 600, almost 30 times as many. 9/4 went from 22 to 482. Again, like 22 or 23 times as many. So it's not just that the hype on the book has dropped. It's that now there are so many 9/8s, 9/6s, 9/4s out there. They have flooded the market and completely filled up any demand that was there. And so you have the prices go all the way back. All right, now let's take a look at another one, and then we'll get into the Dave Stevens books. The other one that really jumped to my mind was Raphael number 1. And so Raphael number 1, if you're, again, not familiar with this book, this is the first appearance of Casey Jones. Really cool book. You know, I think this is a great key. But again, and we're not going to look at the 9/8 quite as much. I mean, you can see the spike in price on the 9/8. This book went from being around a $650 book to around a $6,000 book, around 10x. It's come back. It hasn't sold in a little while. Last sale was almost a year ago. It would probably go down a little bit more if it sold right now, but it's still up, but hasn't corrected quite as much. And you'll see why. You know, we'll talk about that. But let's take a look at like a 9/6. 9/6 prior to that spike in prices during the comic boom was going for around $500. It jumped up to 5,040 at the peak, and it has come down now to as low as 668, some around 1,000. So it's corrected almost all the way back. So let's take a look at the census data. So in this one, we're going to look at June 30th, 2020, before the comic boom. There was a different reason for this spike. This wasn't because of a show. This was just because in the comic boom, this book got really expensive. And so people were motivated to send it in to get graded. And so in 2020, you had 540 on the census, 33 9/8, 64 9/6, 88 9/4. Now we have 2,093. There are 4 times as many copies graded. 9/8 went from 33 to 56, not quite double, a decent jump, but not a huge jump. 9/6 went from 64 to 156, about 2.5 times as many. And a 9/4 went from 88 to 283, about 3 times as many. And so you can see how, again, those books were out there. The value just wasn't there to get them graded. And so there's always going to be a little bit of a lag where you have the spike in price, and then you're going to have people that it takes time to get the books graded. They got to send them into CGC, get them pressed and cleaned and all that. And it takes a little bit for them to get back, and then they will start flooding the market. And that is going to drive down the prices. So we have seen this play out over and over and over again over the last few years with books that were not really either keys or really desirable keys, or were not very expensive and all of a sudden became expensive. And that's what we're seeing now with Dave Stevens books. So we're going to look at some of these that are on this comic link listing here. And so we'll start with the first one, because this is probably the most recognizable Dave Stevens book, Planet Comics number 1. I've talked about this one because I have the Planet Comics, the original one that this one is actually based off of. And I have a 9/4 of that from the Golden Age. But We're going to take a look at this. Planet Comics #1 is currently at 1,400. Minimum next bid is 1,500. 9.8. Now let's look at GPA. So when we look at Planet Comics #1, we see a very similar trend to what we saw during the comic boom. We have, it has been gradually trending up over the last 5-10 years, but then all of a sudden it just took off. And you can see it already had a pretty big correction sale, but we'll say it took off in 2023. So if we pick a time kind of like mid 2022, we'll say that's pre the spike in prices. So if we take a look at this data, and I did June of 2022, you can see that Planet Comics #1 had 247 copies graded, 54 9/8, 51 9/6, 57 9/4. Now let's look at today. Now there's 480 graded, and this is a much shorter window. I mean, there is that lag in when people have to go get the books graded, find them, all that kind of thing. You can see we're at 480 now, so we've approximately doubled the census in this time period. We've gone from 54 9/8 to 76, not a huge jump, about 50%. We've gone from 51 9/6 to 94, almost doubled. And we went from 57 9/4 to 105 9/4, again, almost doubled. So what I'm pointing out here is that while this is a much smaller census compared to something like West Coast Avengers 45, which is a Marvel printing, much bigger printing, I wouldn't expect this census to be as big, but I also wouldn't expect the demand to be as big for this book. So you also have to think about that. The collector base for Dave Stevens is still going to be way smaller than the collector base for White Vision or the collector base for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Those are huge collector bases, much bigger print runs. And so it doesn't really surprise me that these are smaller numbers, but you have to think about who is actually out there to buy them. But again, just in this relatively short period, we have doubled the census of this book. And so I would be very cautious again, that I would expect, it wouldn't be surprised if it kind of returns back down to this mean, this general trend line it had been following. And and maybe even drops lower. Like that could be a risk there too, because if you get a whole bunch out there now that all this value is in there, people see this book sell for almost $3,000 in a 9/8 or even a 9/6. A 9/6 went for 950. There is a lot of motivation there then to get those books graded. And so you're going to keep seeing these books get graded and pop up. And those books that people would have said were rare in a 9/8 aren't really all that rare in a 9/8 or a 9/6. All right, now let's take a look at one that's a little bit less expensive. So now we're going to look at Airboy #5. This is actually kind of like a character from the Golden Age, which actually is a pretty expensive book in the Golden Age, but we've got a 9/8 here of Airboy #5, this Valkyrie cover. And so again, let's take a look at Airboy #5. And so got the 9/8, 9/6. I mean, you can see all these green arrows. I mean, you see these books spiking, and it should just make you nervous. It should make you nervous. But we look at a 9/8. Again, like this one, it had a spike as high as $809, when before it was selling around 250, somewhere in that range, 200, 250, 300. Then let's take a look at a 9/6. 9/6. Again, this one was selling around $100 before the spike, hit a peak of 280. So the prices are a little bit lower, but you're still seeing about triples in the price for this book over a pretty short period of time. So let's take a look at the census data. So Airboy #5, 178 total copies. There's actually a 9/9 out there that is not a recent 9/9. It came in a while ago. 93 9/8, 42 9/6, 23 9/4. And you're going to have a lot of 9/8 because this book didn't have a lot of value unless it was a 9/8. The percentage is going to be pretty high of 9/8. Now we've got 443 copies. So we went from 178 to 443. More than doubled, about 2.5 times, a little more than 2.5 times in that very short period of time. No more 9/9s, haven't had to worry about that yet. But we went from 93 to 160 9/8. We went from 42 to 117 9/6, almost tripled. Went from 23 to 78 9/4, not quite quadrupled, but you get my point here is that we have a lot more copies of this book out there. They are in high grade. And so the likelihood of these books correcting back down is pretty high. So I would be cautious with that. Now, the last book that I'm going to talk about is one of the more rare books, I would say. I'm air quoting rare, even though you can't see me. It's this 3D Zone, number 16. Now, there's two versions of this. There is a variant and a non-variant. I believe this is the variant. Yeah, this is the variant cover. It doesn't have as much text on the top there. So let's see. I don't remember if they have a non-variant in here or not. Yeah, here you go. It's not very much of a change. You see on the top edge there, it says the 3D Zone and then number 16. That is the standard copy. And then if we go up to this copy up here, there's that text isn't there. It's just yellow on the top of the page. That is the difference between the variant and the non-variant. That is what the premium is for in this book. But let's talk about this one. So we go to GPA. This is an expensive book, especially the variant. You can see in December, variant cover sold for $4,070. In April, we had a 9.8 that sold for $1,907, but a peak sale of $2,500. Especially in the variant book, this book is rivaling Planet Comics 1 now. These are going for pretty similar prices. Now let's take a look at the census data for this. So first one here, this is from, again, I did June of 2022. I did mid 2022 before these big spikes in prices. You can see in the regular copy, there were 80 total. We had 15 9/8s, 27 9/6s, 24 9/4s. The variant, I mean, this is one of those where people are like, oh, it doesn't exist in high grade. We had 0 9/8s, 0 9/6s, 194, 192. Let's take a look at what it is now. Now we've got 153 of the regular. Went from 80 to 153. It doubled. Went from 15 9/8s to 28 9/8s. Went from 27 9/6s to 43. Went from 24 9/4s to 34 9/4s. I mean, look at the 9/2s. Went from 6 to 20. So you can see those books that people weren't sending in before that didn't really have a reason to send them in because they were worth more just selling raw than getting them graded are now getting graded. And so you're having pretty big jumps in the upper grades, but even bigger jumps in kind of a 9.2 is a high grade book, but for this era, it's not really all that high of a grade. Now let's talk about the variant. I mean, look at that variant. We went from 0 9/8s to 11. We went from 3 total to 23. 8 times as many copies are graded. Now it's still a low number. I mean, I'll give you that. Like, this is a low number. I don't know how much it'll climb. I don't have any idea how many of those might be out there. But a book where people said there were, no 9/8s out there, or very rare for a 9/8, got 11 of them now. Went from 0 9/6s to 2 9/6s. Went from 194 to 5 9/4s. So this, again, just this type of data really does show you the risk that is out there with these books right now. This is the type of census data that to me is very risky because these books are going to have big spikes in price moving from raw to graded. And there's a lot more graded now. And there's a lot more high graded copies now. And so it's obviously not just these three. Those three are just the three that I made examples of, but it's true for these Alien Worlds books, the Betty Page books, this Crossfire book that's a really popular cover. It's just generally true for all these books that they get more and more copies graded when you have these spikes in price. And in that in itself is going to drive down prices, a few months or a year from now as those books all get graded and come back. So just something, I thought, like, I've just been seeing so much hype being pushed on these Dave Stevens covers that I just wanted to make something to just help people hopefully avoid what was experienced with West Coast Avengers number 45 and what was experienced with Raphael number 1, where people bought into those books and then maybe not realizing how many raws are actually out there. And they just got wrecked as the prices dropped. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, got some useful information out of it. If you did, please hit that like button, subscribe button, notification bell, all that kind of stuff. And I will see you in the next video.